Timothy Burns, known as Tim to his friends, glanced at his phone after leaving a message for his wife, Candace, or Candy, as she preferred to be called. They had been married for 5 years, and he had just closed a service contract with a large California company that had branches nationwide. He knew his boss, Jake Hudson, would be thrilled, as this new deal meant a major expansion for his IT firm. It also meant a substantial raise for Tim. Maybe now, he thought, he and Candy could finally start the family they had always planned. But lately, doubts had been creeping into his mind, doubts that began to surface after a recent camping trip with Jake, just over a week ago. Something about Candy seemed off since he returned from that trip. Her mind seemed elsewhere most of the time, and she was becoming increasingly short with him. But that wasn't the only thing that troubled him. After they got home and tossed their clothes in the laundry basket, he noticed something odd on a pair of her underwear, something in the gusset area. When he picked them up, it had already hardened, and the smell was distinct. Suddenly, it hit him, and his world felt like it was crashing down. Determined to uncover the truth, he made a promise to himself. Since he was heading to the West Coast for work, he decided to consult an attorney to explore his options if Candy had been unfaithful. He couldn't imagine their marriage surviving such a betrayal. "Are you sure your wife is cheating?" asked Ruby Hawkins, a lawyer specializing in family law and divorce, who had come highly recommended by a friend who recently went through a divorce for the same reason. "I'm not 100% sure," Tim admitted. "But I need to find out, and if she is, I want a divorce." "Well," Ruby began, "most divorces in this state are filed without placing blame on anyone. You could file on the grounds of adultery, but you'd need solid proof." "Like what?" Tim asked. "Photos or videos?" "Exactly," Ruby replied. "If you'd like, I can have an investigator follow her to find out the truth." "Yes, please," Tim agreed. "What should I expect during the divorce?" "Since you both earn roughly the same amount, she from her teaching job, there's a good chance you won't have to pay her any alimony," Ruby explained. "You don't own any real estate, and you don't have children, so the assets would likely be divided 50-50. You'll keep your pension, and she'll keep hers. If she has been unfaithful, we'll use that to make sure the outcome is in your favor. I'll start the paperwork and hold off on filing until we have proof." "All right," Tim said, resigned. "Let's do it. I'll be out of town for 3 days, and that's when I think she'll act." Ruby contacted the investigator, Marvin Johnson, who suggested that Tim install a tracking app on Candy's phone. He also provided Tim with a device to record calls on their landline and an audio recorder that he discreetly placed in her purse. Tim hated the idea of spying on his wife, but he had to know the truth. There were other signs too. Ever since the camping trip, Jake had been even more arrogant and condescending than usual, as if he knew something Tim didn't. Tim managed to keep it together for a week, and when Candy drove him to the airport, she kissed him goodbye. "I'll call you after dinner," he promised. "Okay, honey," she replied. "Have a good flight." That night, Tim called Candy as planned. He was surprised when she mentioned she'd be working as a waitress at a party Jake was hosting that evening. One of the waitresses had called in sick, and Jake had asked Candy to fill in. "I didn't even know Jake was throwing a party," Tim said, feeling uneasy. "He promised to pay me $150 for the night," Candy explained. "I could use the extra money since I won't be back at work for a couple more weeks." Tim knew her classes would start up again soon, and she could certainly use the money, but something didn't sit right with him. "All right," Tim said cautiously. "Go ahead, but be careful, and tell me how it goes tomorrow." "Okay," she said. "You know I love you, right?" "Yeah, I love you too," Tim replied, though a knot was already forming in his stomach. After the call, he immediately reached out to the investigator. "I just wanted to let you know that Candy will be at Jake's tonight." Tim had been speaking with Marvin about the waitress at a party at Jake Hudson's house. "Okay," Tim said, and Marvin replied, "We've got what we needed. I'll send everything over to you." "Thanks," Tim said, ending the conversation. The next day, he tried calling his wife Candy on her cell phone, but she didn't pick up. He tried their home phone too, but only got the answering machine. Of course, she didn't stay the night with Jake, he reassured himself. But his hopes were shattered when an email from Marvin arrived later that day. Candy spent the night at Hudson's house and she's still there, the email read. She was very busy last night. I've attached a couple of photos, but be warned, they're pretty graphic. I'll give you the full report when you're back. Tim opened the attachments, and his heart dropped. There she was, his wife of 5 years, having sex with 3 men. 3 men he had once considered friends. His hands trembled, and tears filled his eyes. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. He tried calling her again, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried the home phone too, but again, just the answering machine. He didn't leave a message. Instead, he headed to the hotel bar to drown his sorrows. The next morning, Tim checked the tracker and saw Candy's phone was still at Jake's house. She hadn't left. Marvin confirmed it with another email, this time including 2 more photos. The content was similar to the first, but this time there were 10 men involved, including Jake, his son Mike, and 5 employees from Jake's IT company, people Tim had once trusted. He didn't recognize the other 3, but assumed they were Mike's friends. After wrapping up his business with the California client, Tim checked out of his hotel and took an earlier flight home. When he arrived at the airport, he noticed Candy's car was missing. Checking the tracker again, her phone was still at Jake's house. Tim went inside, changed his clothes, and called Ruby's office. To his surprise, her receptionist said Ruby was free that afternoon. He called Candy again, and this time she picked up. She sounded out of breath when she answered. "Hello?" she said. "Hey, it's me, Tim. Where are you?" he asked. "I'm at home, just finishing up a few things before heading to class," she lied. Tim was stunned at how easily she could deceive him. "I see," he said. "Well, I'm done in California. I'm on my way home." "Oh, okay," she replied. "I've missed you so much. Call me when you land, and I'll pick you up at the airport." "No need. I'll grab a taxi. Bye," he said, ending the call. He wondered if she realized he didn't tell her he loved her or that he'd see her soon. Shaking his head, he left the house to visit Ruby. Meanwhile, Candy looked at her phone after the call ended. Tim always told her he loved her before hanging up, but this time he hadn't. She noticed his voice had been unusually cold. She had intended to return home after that first night at Jake's, but being between him and his son Mike was so satisfying, she just couldn't bring herself to leave. "I owe this to myself," she rationalized. "It'll all be over once classes start again. Tim will never know." So, she stayed another night and the next day with Jake and Mike. On the second day, Jake went to work for a few hours, but Mike kept her busy, even arranging for several of his friends to join them. When Jake returned, she was having sex with Mike in Jake's bed. Once they were done, Jake looked at her and smirked. "Maybe I should send your husband out of town more often. You know my classes are starting soon," she said. "I won't be available for a week." "I wouldn't dare do anything like this while Tim's home." "Why not?" Jake asked. "Maybe for a change, he'd enjoy seeing how real men treat you." Both he and Mike laughed. "Well, I have to admit, I've had a great time," Candy said, "but I still love Tim. I don't want to hurt him." "Don't worry," Jake said with a grin, "maybe I can arrange for him to be gone for another weekend soon. That way, you can come and hang out with us at the house," Jake said with a smirk. Candy, looking unsure, replied, "That sounds ridiculous. At some point, Tim's going to figure it out. He's not stupid, you know." "Don't worry," Jake assured her, picking up his video camera with a grin. "I'll handle Timmy boy. You just leave that to me." Candy sighed. "There's just one thing." "What is it?" she asked. "I don't want you sleeping with him anymore," Jake said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "You belong to us now. Understood? Candy's eyes widened slightly. But how am I supposed to pull that off? You'll figure it out, Jake said with a shrug. Make up some excuse. You know, like a headache or something. You'll come up with something. Okay, I'll try, she said, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. Later that day, several of Jake's friends came over to try some of Candy's homemade products. Among the guests, Jake had invited a few single men, turning the gathering into a much wilder party than Candy had expected. She found herself caught up in the attention and excitement, almost forgetting about the reality of her life with Tim. Meanwhile, Tim's world was crumbling. Marvin, the investigator, had gathered irrefutable evidence of Candy's infidelity. The photographs were bad enough, but what truly devastated Tim were the 2 DVDs of videos. In them, Candy engaged in things with other men that she had never once done with him. It was shocking, disgusting even, and Tim felt his love for her evaporating with every passing second as he watched. His wife, who had shared his bed for 5 years, was now a complete stranger. How could she do this to me? Tim asked himself, over and over again. 5 years of marriage, gone in an instant. What did I do to deserve this? His thoughts kept drifting back to Jake. Jake, his boss and supposed friend, was older, wiser, or so Tim had thought. Now, he saw Jake for who he really was, a manipulative traitor. I'll file for divorce citing adultery, Ruby Hawkins, his lawyer, said calmly. And if you want, we can file a lawsuit for alienation of affection against Jake and the other men involved. Will it work? Tim asked, still numb from everything he had seen. These cases don't always go far, Ruby admitted. But I think we can negotiate a strong settlement given the circumstances. Do whatever you need to do, Tim said, his voice hollow. Ruby glanced at him, her expression softening. Just don't do anything rash, Tim. I don't want to have to bail you out of jail. Tim forced a weak smile. Don't worry, Ruby. I'm not going to do anything stupid. When can we get the paperwork ready? He asked. I can have it ready in a couple of days. In the meantime, try to act as normal as you can around your wife. Don't raise any suspicions. Tim shook his head. I'm not much of an actor, Ruby. And after what I've seen, I won't ever touch her again. Who knows what diseases she's picked up from all those men. Tell her you're not feeling well, Ruby suggested. That should buy you some time. Tim nodded in agreement and left the office. Sitting in his car, the reality of his situation weighed on him heavily. There was no way he could continue working for Jake, not after knowing what kind of man he really was. How could he stand to be in the same room as him, let alone work for him? Scrolling through his contacts, he found the number he needed and dialed it, hoping for a bit of good news. John Carlson speaking, answered a voice on the other end. John, it's Tim Burns, Tim said, his voice strained but determined. Tim. How are you, old friend? John's voice was warm and welcoming. Honestly, I've been better, Tim said. Listen, is that position at Empire still open? John Carlson, the CEO of Empire, had been trying to recruit Tim for years, but Tim had always felt loyal to Jake and his company. Now, that loyalty was shattered beyond repair. Absolutely, John replied. Are you finally ready to join a reputable company? He asked with a laugh. Yeah, something like that, Tim said with a dry chuckle. Let's just say, things have changed, and I can't work where I am anymore. I'm really sorry to hear that, Tim, John said, his tone softening. Is there anything I can do to help? Just give me the job, Tim said. I'll work just as hard for you as I did for Jake. Consider it done, John said, without hesitation. Can you start on Monday? Absolutely, Tim said, feeling a small sense of relief for the first time in days. Great, John said. Hey, why don't you and Candy come over tonight? Rose is making her famous lasagna, and we can talk about your compensation package. Tim hesitated. I'd love to, but I can't bring Candy, he said quietly. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Is everything okay? John asked, his voice filled with concern. I'd rather not get into it over the phone, Tim said. But if you're up for it, I can explain a bit more tonight. Of course, Tim, John said, his tone now serious. You know Rose is a licensed counselor. Maybe she can help too, if you need it. That actually sounds good, John, Tim replied, grateful for the offer. I appreciate it. Great, I'll let Rose know. Can you be here by 6:30? Absolutely, Tim said. See you then. And thanks again, John. My pleasure, Tim, John said before hanging up. Tim sat in the car, feeling as though a massive weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The path forward was still uncertain, but at least he had a way out. Starting the car, he headed home, dreading what he would find when he arrived. As he pulled up to the house, he noticed something strange. Tim sat in the quiet of their home, the hours dragging on while Candy still hadn't returned from Jake's house. Frustrated and restless, he grabbed his briefcase and headed inside. After a hot shower and a change of clothes, he sat down at his computer, staring at the screen for a moment before starting to type. He began drafting a letter of resignation. It wasn't long before the front door creaked open, and Candy finally walked in. Around 5 p.m. she noticed her husband at the computer and approached him with a soft smile, leaning in to kiss him. But to her surprise, he turned his head slightly, causing her lips to land awkwardly on his cheek. Taken aback, she pulled back and stared at him, trying to read his face. Is everything okay? She asked, concern edging into her voice. Not really, Tim said, not meeting her eyes. I don't feel great. Maybe it's just jet lag, or... I don't know. I'll sleep on the futon tonight. Sleep on the futon? Why? Will you come back later? Candy asked, her worry growing. Where are you going? I'm meeting someone for dinner, Tim said casually, standing up and starting to gather his things. Candy's voice cracked slightly. Are you seeing another woman? There was genuine fear in her voice now. Tim stopped, turned to look at her, and replied coldly, You mean, am I cheating on you? He stared at her for a long moment before continuing, No, Candy, I'm not. In all the years we've been together, I've never cheated on you, and I have no intention of starting now. Can you say the same? Candy's heart pounded in her chest. She recoiled slightly, her mind racing. Does he know? She wondered. No, there's no way. He couldn't possibly know. Of course I can say the same, she said, her voice shaky but trying to sound convincing. Tim's expression remained unreadable. He wasn't convinced. How was your trip to California? Candy asked, desperately trying to change the subject. It was successful, Tim replied flatly. He then glanced at her, his tone turning icy. How was your time at Jake's house? Candy swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. Everything went well, she said, forcing a smile. Even when it was difficult, it was still fun. I bet, Tim replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. He checked his watch, then sighed. I guess I'll go. He saved his work on the computer and shut it down before standing up. Without another word, he walked past her and headed to the master bedroom to change into something less casual. When he returned, Candy was sitting on the sofa, her anxiety growing. How long will you be gone? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Tim replied shortly, grabbing his keys. Don't wait up. He walked toward the door without looking back, and Candy couldn't help but notice the stark difference in his behavior. He didn't kiss her. He didn't say he loved her. He always did those things before he left the house. This time, nothing. As Tim's car pulled out of the driveway, Candy stared after him, her heart heavy with dread. She grabbed the home phone and quickly dialed Jake, unaware that her conversation was being recorded. Jake, she whispered urgently when he picked up, I think Tim knows something. What makes you think that? Jake asked casually, his voice calm as ever. He didn't touch me at all, Candy said, panic rising. Usually, he kisses me and tells me he loves me before he leaves. But he didn't. He seemed so cold. And he just left for dinner. With who? Jake asked, sounding more interested. I don't know. He didn't say. Candy's voice trembled. Jake, what if he knows? What if he's planning to leave me? Jake chuckled on the other end. So what if he does? You can always come and stay with us. Don't worry about Timmy boy. I'll keep him so busy that he'll hardly ever be home. I don't want to lose him, Candy exclaimed, her desperation palpable. I love him, Jake. Jake laughed heartily. Oh, come on, Candy. You've shown us all just how much you love him these past few days, haven't you? It's not funny, Jake, she snapped, her guilt flaring. I know what I did with you and Mike, and yes, I liked it. But I still love Tim. I don't want to lose him. Relax, Jake said coolly. Let him stew over this for a while. He'll come around. And if he doesn't, well, we'll deal with it. Candy's stomach twisted with unease. You're not going to hurt him, are you? Oh, no, Candy, Jake replied, though there was a sinister edge to his voice. We'll just help him understand how things are going to work from now on. And you'll help us. Candy froze. Help? What do you mean? When the time comes, Jake said, his tone darkening, you'll help explain everything to him. After all, you wouldn't want the school board seeing the videos we have of you, would you? Candy's blood ran cold. You wouldn't dare. Oh, I would. And I'd love every second of it, Jake said with a sly grin in his voice. I've got plenty of footage of you, Candy. Your ass is mine now. So, you'd better keep Tim in line, or things will get messy. Candy felt trapped, her world closing in around her. With a deep sigh, she relented. Okay, Jake. I'll do what you want. Just don't hurt him. Jake's laughter echoed through the phone. Sure, sure. As you say, sweetheart. Meanwhile, Tim pulled up to a large two-story house on the other side of town. It belonged to John and Rose Carlson, his friends and colleagues. Grabbing a bottle of wine he had picked up on the way, he rang the doorbell. John opened the door with a warm smile. Tim, good to see you. And thanks for the wine, this'll go to good use tonight. Tim smiled faintly and followed John inside, where Rose was waiting at the dining table. The smell of homemade lasagna filled the air, and Tim felt a slight wave of relief wash over him. Tim, this is my wife, Rose, John said, introducing them. Rose, this is Tim Burns, our new customer service rep. Rose extended her hand with a kind smile. Nice to meet you, Tim. Tim shook her hand, grateful for the distraction from the turmoil waiting for him back home. Tim smiled politely as Rose introduced herself. It's a pleasure to meet you too, Mrs. Carlson. Please, call me Rose, she replied with a warm smile. Mrs. Carlson sounds so formal. They all settled in at the table as Rose began serving lasagna while John poured wine. The aroma of the dish filled the room, and Tim couldn't help but compliment the meal after his first bite. This is the best lasagna I've ever had, Tim said, genuinely impressed. I'm glad you like it, Rose replied. This is one of my specialties. John leaned in, his tone more serious. Tim, I don't want to pry, but I'm curious. What made you leave Jake's company so suddenly? Tim took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts before speaking. Yeah, something happened. Please, Tim, Rose said gently. Tell us what's going on. Tim hesitated for a moment, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him. Then he began to recount the betrayal, the infidelity, the gut-wrenching evidence that had shattered his life. As he spoke, the room fell silent. When he finished, John shook his head in disbelief. Damn, Tim, John said quietly, that's chilling. I can't imagine what you're going through. Something similar happened to me once, but not on this level. So, what's the plan now? Rose asked softly. Other than switching jobs? I've already met with a lawyer, Tim explained. We're moving forward with the divorce. My lawyer says it'll be a pretty even split. Rose nodded thoughtfully. Have you thought about counseling? You're going through so much, talking to someone could really help. Tim sighed, his shoulders sagging. I don't know if that would help, Rose. Candy has changed so much, it's like she flipped a switch overnight. I never thought she'd do something like this. How are you holding up? Rose asked, concern in her voice. Honestly? Not well, Tim admitted. My lawyer told me to try to act normal around Candy, but it's almost impossible. I can't even look at her right now. Rose's expression softened. I think seeing a psychologist could really help you work through this, Tim. Sometimes it helps just to talk. John chimed in, nodding in agreement. Rose is right. She's the best in the business, she helped me through some really dark times. And with your new job, it's covered under your benefits. Tim laughed, a little surprised. That's definitely A+. I'm serious, Tim, John said, his tone firm. Rose was a lifesaver for me. I know she can help you too. Rose smiled reassuringly. I think we could set up an hour a week, Tim. What do you say? Tim thought it over for a moment. The idea of sitting down with a therapist wasn't something he'd ever considered before, but after everything that had happened, maybe it was what he needed. Okay, Tim said finally. I'll do it. John smiled and patted Tim's shoulder. Good man. I'll make sure you have the time for your sessions. Work with Rose, and let me know how it goes. I will, Tim said, feeling a bit of the burden ease. Thanks. Well, John said, standing, if you don't mind, Tim and I will head to my office to go over the details of his new role. Of course, Rose said, still smiling. And I look forward to working with you too, Tim. Thank you, Tim replied, standing to follow John into his home office. Once inside, John poured them both a glass of brandy, and they spent the next 2 hours discussing the job, compensation, and everything else Tim needed to know. By the end of their conversation, Tim felt a renewed sense of control over his life, something he hadn't felt in days. Shaking John's hand, Tim left feeling hopeful. But as he drove home, his mood darkened again. It was close to 10 p.m. when he pulled into the driveway. The house lights were still on, and he prayed Candy was alone. He stepped inside, and there she was, sitting on the couch. How was your meeting? She asked casually. It went well, Tim replied, trying to sound neutral. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to bed. Good night. Without waiting for a response, he headed into the second bedroom, where his computer was set up. As he started undressing, Candy appeared in the doorway. Are you sleeping in here now? She asked. Yes, Tim said flatly. I'm still not feeling great, so I'll sleep on the futon. Is that a problem? Candy hesitated. No, I guess not. It's just. You've been gone for 3 days, and I was hoping we could, spend some time together. The thought of touching her repulsed him. I'm not in the mood tonight, he said coldly. Okay, she whispered, clearly disappointed. Maybe tomorrow? We'll see, he said dismissively. Candy turned and walked away, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that Tim knew more than he was letting on. But she didn't press the issue. The next morning, Tim woke up early. Candy was still asleep. He grabbed his resignation letter and poured himself a cup of coffee. On the kitchen table, he noticed Candy's purse. Without hesitation, he retrieved the audio recorder and downloaded the previous day's phone conversations. He left the house without saying goodbye or telling Candy he loved her. As he closed the door behind him, Candy stirred in bed, tears welling in her eyes. At the office, Tim greeted his secretary briefly and went straight into his office. He had no interest in talking to anyone. He began packing his things when Jake walked in. "What's going on here?" Jake asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Tim didn't hesitate. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out 2 envelopes, and handed them to Jake. "One of these is a signed contract from California," Tim began. "The other is my resignation." Tim sat in Jake's office, his face emotionless, though inside he was boiling with rage. He calmly handed over the letter he had spent all night writing. "Here's my resignation," he said flatly, effective immediately. Jake's face contorted in shock as he quickly scanned the letter. "What? Resignation? Tim, what the hell is going on? Why are you leaving? I need you, seriously, man, we're just getting started with the California contract. I don't understand." Tim looked at Jake, his expression icy. "You really don't know, Jake?" His voice was cold but steady. "Do you think I'm some kind of idiot? You've got some nerve acting clueless. But let's be real, this isn't about work. I'm done here. I've already found a new job, and after I visit HR, I'm out." "Wait, Tim, let's talk this through," Jake pleaded, rising from his chair. "We can work this out." Tim shook his head, rising from his seat with a look of finality. "There's nothing to discuss, Jake. I'm done. You weren't just my boss, you were supposed to be my friend. And you stabbed me in the back in the worst possible way. You didn't just ruin our work relationship, you ruined my marriage." Jake flinched but quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Oh, so this is about Candy," he said, his tone shifting to something more mocking. "Well, for the record, your wife was more than happy to sleep with me. She wasn't some innocent victim, Tim. Maybe you should loosen up a bit, let her have her fun. She'll come back to you when she's done." Tim stared at him, barely believing what he was hearing. "You actually think I'd be okay with that?" He spat out the words, his hands clenching into fists. "How long has this been going on, Jake? How long have you been sneaking around with her?" Jake shrugged nonchalantly, leaning back in his chair as if they were talking about something trivial. "The first time? It was on that camping trip a few months ago. You remember, right? The second day, when you and the guys were out skiing. She came after me, Tim, practically begged me. And yeah, she even mentioned that I was bigger than you." Tim's face burned with anger, but he remained eerily calm. "That's why you had me leave early to take care of some fake emergency at the office, wasn't it? You wanted me out of the way so you could screw my wife." Jake grinned, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Yeah, so what?" he said. "And by the way, that waitress gig at my party? Just another excuse to get her alone. Worked like a charm." Tim's chest tightened, but instead of exploding, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a quiet click, he stopped the audio recording he had been running since the moment Jake had entered the office. "Thanks for your honesty, Jake," Tim said, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "Now, if you don't mind, I'm done here. I'll be heading to HR to finalize things. Goodbye." Jake's smug expression faltered. "Wait, what the hell are you going to do with that recording? You can't use that." Tim cut him off, glaring. "Watch me." He turned to leave, pausing only when Jake picked up a framed photo of Candy that had once sat on Tim's desk. "You forgot this," Jake sneered, waving the photo in the air. Tim turned, his eyes hard. "I didn't forget. I don't want it. You and your son can have her. I'm done with both of you. You're both going to rot in hell." Without another word, Tim walked out of the office, leaving Jake behind, dumbfounded and seething. Jake stared after him, wondering how everything had fallen apart so quickly. How did Tim even find out? He wondered. Later that day, Jake called Candy to update her. "Tim knows," he said flatly when she answered. Candy's heart sank. "What? How? What did you tell him?" she asked, her voice shaky with fear. "I told him the truth," Jake replied, unfazed. About the first time we hooked up on the hike. You idiot, Candy hissed, panic flooding her chest. Jake shrugged, indifferent. So what? He's out. Left me his resignation and even dropped off that photo of you he used to keep on his desk. He said he didn't need it anymore. Tears welled up in Candy's eyes as the weight of everything came crashing down. What do we do now? She whispered, her voice breaking. Not my problem, Jake said, dismissively. He's your husband, you figure it out. Unless, of course, you want me to step in and make him see things differently. No, Candy snapped. You've done enough already. Stay out of this. Whatever you say, Jake replied casually before hanging up. Candy stared at her phone in disbelief, tears streaming down her face. She hadn't wanted things to spiral out of control like this. She had never imagined him finding out, let alone leaving her. She loved him, despite everything, despite the mistakes she had made, she loved him. But she also knew that Tim wasn't the kind of man who would tolerate betrayal. A divorce seemed inevitable now, and the thought of it tore her apart. Sobbing, she sank onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. How had everything gotten so messed up? She wondered. She had never wanted to hurt Tim, but now she had no idea how to fix it. A few minutes later, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped her back to reality. Tim was home. Wiping away her tears, Candy peered out the window and saw his car parked beside hers. She quickly looked around for any sign of Jake's car but saw nothing. Relieved, but still panicked, she waited for Tim to come inside. Tim entered the house quietly, his face unreadable. He didn't look at her as he set down a box and his briefcase by the door. Candy stood up, her hands trembling, unsure of what to say. Tim. She began, her voice weak. He didn't respond, heading straight for the bedroom. Moments later, she heard the sound of drawers opening and clothes being packed into a suitcase. Candy felt her heart breaking all over again. She followed him to the bedroom doorway, watching helplessly as he packed. Tim, please. I didn't mean for things to get like this, she pleaded, her voice cracking with emotion. I love you. Tim finally stopped, turning to face her. His eyes were cold, his face hard. You should have thought about that before, he said, his voice as sharp as a knife. He zipped up his suitcase and walked past her without another word. As he walked out of the house, Candy collapsed onto the bed, her sobs echoing through the empty room. Tim walked into the house, spotting Candy sitting on the couch. Without saying a word, he went straight to his office, locking the door behind him. His hands trembled as he searched for the voice recordings, his mind racing. He finally found the recording of the conversation between Candy and Jake, listening to every painful word. Afterward, he forwarded it to his lawyer and dialed her number. Hi Tim, she greeted. I just received your email. I'm working on your documents now. Good, Tim replied. When can they be submitted? If you'd like, I can expedite things and have them delivered later this afternoon, she said. That works, he replied before hanging up the phone. Tim stood silently for a moment, the weight of the past few days settling on his shoulders. He walked over to his gun safe, opened it, and pulled out his old .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol. He didn't intend to use it, but after everything that had happened, he didn't want to take any chances with Jake, or Candy. He walked into the kitchen, placing the gun on the table next to his briefcase. Candy glanced at the gun, her face pale. We need to talk, he said, his voice cold and controlled. Is this really necessary? She asked, pointing to the gun. I hope not, Tim replied, but I want to be prepared in case your lover decides to show up. My lover? Candy asked, feigning innocence. Don't play dumb, Tim snapped. I'm not in the mood for games. Sit down, we need to talk. Candy hesitated before sitting down, fear flickering across her face. She had no idea what Tim was capable of in that moment. First things first, Tim began, his tone hard and unforgiving. Later today, someone will be by to serve you with the divorce papers. Candy's face turned ashen. Divorce? She whispered, her voice trembling. Why? I don't want a divorce. I love you. Tim scoffed. Love? You've got a funny way of showing it. I know everything about you, Jake, his son, and all the others you've been entertaining these past few days. So yes, I've filed for divorce on the grounds of adultery. Adultery? Candy stammered. You have no proof of that. Tim smirked, pulling an envelope from his briefcase. He tossed it on the table, the contents spilling out. Photos, each one time-stamped, clearly showing Candy with multiple men, including Jake. I've got more than just photos, Tim said, his voice steady. I've got video and audio too. Would you like to watch? Candy's face drained of color, and she shook her head, realizing there was no escape. Given the circumstances, I've been more than fair, Tim continued. No spousal support. You get half of what's in the bank, and we each keep our pensions. I've already canceled your credit cards, but I've got a cashier's check for your half of the remaining funds. Oh, and there's a restraining order in place. You're required to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, and my office. Candy's eyes filled with tears. Are you kicking me out? That's exactly what I'm doing, Tim replied, his voice as cold as ice. You have until the papers are served to pack your things. And what if I decide to contest the divorce? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tim let out a bitter laugh. I wouldn't advise that. What do you think the school board would say if certain photos and videos were to find their way into the public eye? Do you think the parents of your students would want someone like you teaching their kids? Candy's face fell. You wouldn't dare. Do you really want to take that risk? Tim asked, his gaze piercing. She looked down at her hands, defeated. No, she whispered. I need my job. That's what I thought, Tim said, his voice cold and resolute. There are a couple more things you need to know. Candy looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. What else? She asked, her voice shaky. You'll be required to hand over your wedding rings and give up my last name, Tim said firmly. Candy gasped, her hands trembling as she slowly removed her rings. You've become a heartless bastard, she said, her voice barely audible. You gave me a good reason, Tim replied, his expression unchanging. I just want to know one thing, what happened? What made you go from a loving, faithful wife to this? Candy lowered her eyes, her voice trembling as she spoke. It happened on the second day of the hike, she began. You were out on the boat, and I was in the tent. Jake walked by and saw me. I was already undressed, just trying to rest. He seemed embarrassed at first, but then we started talking. And then, well, he pulled his pants down, and that was it. So, a man takes off his pants, and you immediately decide to cheat? Tim's voice was filled with disgust. That's all it took for you to betray me? Candy swallowed hard, her voice small. It happened twice, she confessed. The first time when you were jet skiing, and the second time when Jake sent you back to the office. Tim shook his head, his lips curling in disdain. I noticed none of your lovers used any protection, he said coldly. Were you even worried about getting pregnant? Or catching something? I'm still on the pill, she muttered. That doesn't mean you can't get pregnant, Tim shot back. And it sure as hell doesn't protect you from diseases. Was this part of your grand plan? Oh God, no, Candy sobbed, burying her face in her hands. Tim stood up, his patience long gone. Pack your things and leave, he said quietly but firmly. This is over. Tim stood in the doorway, watching Candy sob as she pleaded with him. Tim, please, can't we work through this? I'll never do it again, I promise. We could see a therapist, talk to someone, there has to be a way back from this. But Tim shook his head, his expression cold and resolute. Do you know how many women, who look like goddesses compared to you, have tried to tempt me while we were together? He said, his voice low but cutting. I turned them all down because I believed I had something better at home, A loving, faithful wife. I thought I had that. But you didn't even hesitate. You didn't care about me or what you were doing. I hope it was worth it. Candy's tears flowed harder, her shoulders trembling. Please, Tim, I'm begging you, she whimpered. Just give me one more chance. We can go to counseling. I'll change, I'll be better. Tim's eyes hardened even further, his mouth a tight line. There's no coming back from this, he said, each word stinging like venom. Maybe if it was a one-time thing, if you were drunk or something, I could have found a way to look past it. But that's not what happened, is it? You were a willing participant from the moment Jake unbuckled his pants, and you kept going back. I can never forgive that. Candy looked desperate now, her voice shaking as she tried one last time. But don't you love me enough to get through this? We've been together so long, doesn't that count for something? Tim's reply was swift and merciless. I can't even stand the sight of you right now, he said, turning away from her. The sooner you're gone, the better. Pack your things and get out. Anything you leave behind will be burned, thrown away, or donated. Now, start packing. With a sob, Candy got up and shuffled to the master bedroom, her heart shattered. Tim stood in the hallway, arms crossed, watching as she pulled garbage bags out of the closet, stuffing them with her clothes, shoes, and other belongings. After a while, she paused, looking back at him through tear-filled eyes. Can you at least help me carry this to the car? She asked, her voice small. No, Tim replied coldly. It's your trash. Deal with it yourself. And don't forget, anything you leave behind gets burned, including the wedding dress. Her face fell in disbelief. You'd burn my wedding dress? She asked, shocked. My parents spent thousands on that dress. Then you'd better take it, Tim said bluntly. Because if you don't, I will burn it. Candy sobbed as she lugged a bag out to the car, then returned for more. Hours passed, and she was still at it, her energy drained. She finally slumped onto a chair, exhausted. I can't fit anything else in the car, she said, wiping her sweaty forehead. Can I come back later for the rest? Tim's voice was firm. No. You won't be allowed within 150 feet of this place again. If you want your parents to come get the rest, I'll give them a few days, but after that, it's gone. Thank you, Tim, Candy said softly, her voice barely a whisper. I appreciate it. She sat there for a moment, lost in thought, then spoke again. What am I going to tell my parents? She asked, almost as if talking to herself. Tim's reply was sharp. Try telling them the truth, he said. Tell them you cheated on your husband with his boss and probably others, and that's why I threw you out. Be honest for once. She looked at him in horror. If I tell them that, they'll disown me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not my problem, Tim replied, shrugging. But I promise you this, if you try to make me out to be the bad guy, if you lie to them or make it sound like this was my fault, it's going to be a lot worse for you. You know how your parents feel about liars. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Tim's gaze shifted toward the sound. That's for you, he said, motioning for her to answer. Candy, trembling, opened the door to find a deputy sheriff standing there. Candace Burns? The deputy asked. Candy nodded slowly, her throat tight. Yes, she whispered. Do you have any identification? The deputy asked. Candy handed over her driver's license with shaky hands, and after a brief glance, the deputy returned it along with a large envelope. You've been served, ma'am, he said. You're required to vacate the premises immediately. You can sign the divorce papers now if you'd like. Candy's hands shook as she opened the envelope and skimmed through the papers. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, then asked for a pen. With trembling fingers, she signed the documents, tears streaming down her face. I'll take these back to your lawyer, the deputy said, nodding. You need to leave now. If you come back, you'll be arrested. I understand, she whispered, tears flowing freely as she looked back at Tim one last time. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. Tim didn't look at her, his face as hard as stone. "Yeah," he said. "Me too. Goodbye." "Goodbye," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she stepped out of the house. The deputy followed her, giving Tim a curt nod before leaving with her. The next few days were a whirlwind for Tim. Candy didn't try to contact him, but Jake did, twice, leaving threatening voicemails on Tim's home phone. "Damn it, Tim, I know you're there." Jake's voice snarled. "If you don't drop this lawsuit, I'll come over and kick your ass." Tim only smiled as he saved the voicemail, forwarding it to his lawyer, Ruby, who promptly notified the local sheriff's office. Candy's parents also reached out, asking if they could pick up the rest of her things. Tim agreed without hesitation. "Of course," he said, keeping his voice calm. "Just let me know when." The calm after the storm was beginning to settle in. As far as Tim was concerned, it was the end of a nightmare, one he never thought he'd have to live through. George sighed deeply as he spoke into the phone. "You're sure she's not with you? She's got that restraining order against her, you know." "Yeah, I'm sure," Tim replied. A few hours later, George and Bernice, Candy's parents, arrived at Tim's house. They gathered the remaining belongings Candy had left behind, but their visit wasn't just about picking up her things. Bernice had an agenda. She wanted to convince Tim to call off the divorce. "Tim, she made a mistake," Bernice began, her voice pleading. "Surely you can forgive her. She's crazy about you." Tim's expression was unreadable. "What exactly did she tell you, Bernice?" "She said she had a disagreement with your boss," Bernice explained. "That's all she really mentioned." "And that's it?" Tim asked, his tone skeptical. "Well, yes. She didn't go into detail, and we didn't press her for more," Bernice said, her voice faltering. Tim reached for a nearby envelope, filled with photographs and DVDs. He laid them on the table and gestured for Bernice and George to take a look. As they flipped through the pictures, their faces turned pale, and Bernice covered her mouth in shock. "My God," Bernice whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "I had no idea it was this bad." "Tim, I'm so sorry." "I don't blame you," Tim said calmly. "But I wanted you to know the full truth. As you can see, it's a lot worse than she let on." George's face flushed with anger. "I'll have a long talk with that foolish daughter of ours," he growled. "This is unbelievable." "Have you done anything else with these photos?" he asked. "Not yet," Tim replied, "but I'm hoping she doesn't try to contest the divorce. I want this over with." Bernice and George stayed for a few more minutes, offering their apologies and condolences. They finished packing up the rest of Candy's things, gave Tim a warm hug, and left, wishing him well. Later that evening, Tim was watching TV when there was a loud knock on the door. He peered through the peephole and was alarmed to see Jake, Mike, and two of his former work colleagues standing outside. Tim's heart raced as he hurried to his office, retrieved his gun from the safe, and dialed 911. He held the gun behind his back as he cautiously opened the door. Before he could say anything, Jake lunged forward. "We're going to kick your ass, Tim," Jake growled, his face twisted in anger. Tim didn't flinch. He calmly pulled out the gun, leveling it at Jake's chest. The men froze in their tracks. "You really want to test that theory?" Tim asked, his voice steady. "Because I've already called 911, and the police are on their way. When they get here, you'll be arrested for violating the restraining order." One of the other men, Mike, looked nervously at Jake. "Jake, I think he's serious." Jake hesitated, his eyes flicking between Tim and the gun. Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air, and red and blue lights flashed outside the house. "Yeah, I'm serious," Tim said, his eyes locked on Jake's. Before Jake could respond, two large police officers entered the doorway. Tim lowered the gun and placed it on the kitchen table. "Put the gun down, sir," one of the officers ordered, though Tim had already complied. "These men broke into my house and violated the restraining order," Tim explained. "They threatened me, and I want them arrested." "Do you have a copy of the order?" asked the second officer. "Yes, right here," Tim said, pulling the envelope from the kitchen table and handing it over. The officer scanned the document for a few moments, then handed it back to Tim before turning to the four men. "Turn around and put your hands behind your backs," the officer ordered, his voice firm. The men glared at Tim as they were handcuffed, their faces filled with a mix of anger and defeat. After reading them their rights, one of the officers turned to Tim. "Do you have a license for this firearm?" the officer asked. "Yes, sir," Tim said, pulling out his wallet and showing his driver's license and NRA firearms training card. The officer examined the cards and nodded. "All right," he said, "just be careful with it, okay?" "I will, officer." "Thank you," Tim replied, feeling a wave of relief wash over him as the men were escorted out of his home. The next 3 months were a blur for Tim. He threw himself into his new job at Empire, which he found much more fulfilling than working under Jake. His weekly counseling sessions with Rose helped him process his anger and trust issues. He joined a gym and started working out 3 days a week, and even took up martial arts for mental discipline. On Rose's recommendation, he also overhauled his diet, feeling healthier and more in control of his life than he had in years. The divorce went through smoothly, as Candy didn't contest it. However, Tim was still pursuing alienation of affection lawsuits against the men Candy had been involved with. 2 of them had already lost their jobs due to the scandal, but the case against Jake was the one that surprised everyone, including Tim and his lawyer, Ruby. The repercussions were just beginning. At the conclusion of the trial, after hearing testimony and reviewing all the evidence, including Jake's financial statements, the judge ruled in Tim's favor. Jake was ordered to pay $1 million in damages. As the verdict was handed down, the judge didn't mince words when addressing Jake. "Mr. Hudson, your conduct in this matter is reprehensible," the judge said sternly. "Not only did you betray a man who considered you a friend, but you also abused your position as his employer and legal counsel to deliberately destroy his marriage and family. Additionally, you've repeatedly violated the restraining order against you. Therefore, I find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Taylor, and order you to pay $1 million in compensation." Jake's lawyer quickly stood, protesting. "Your Honor, this ruling is beyond unfair. It's..." The judge cut him off. "Mr. Winthrop, this court finds Mr. Hudson's actions not only illegal but utterly disgraceful. The decision stands. The only question now is when this restitution will be paid." "When should this payment be made?" Winthrop asked, clearly exasperated. "Immediately," the judge replied. "Unless, of course, your client prefers to spend some time in jail for contempt of court." Winthrop sighed and sat back down. "No, Your Honor. My client will comply and pay as ordered." "Good," the judge said, glaring at Jake. "And God help you if that check bounces. This case is closed." With a loud bang of the gavel, the trial ended. Jake reluctantly wrote out the check and handed it to his lawyer, who passed it to the court bailiff. After confirming the details, the bailiff handed the check to Ruby, Tim's lawyer, who then presented it to Tim. To Tim's surprise, the check cleared, and Ruby took her portion of the judgment without issue. In the weeks following the trial, word of the lawsuit and the scandal spread quickly. Many of Jake's clients, shocked by his behavior, began distancing themselves from him. Some even terminated their contracts, fearing that a man capable of destroying a friend's marriage for personal gain couldn't be trusted in business either. Tim was certain Jake would be bankrupt within a year. During this time, Tim chose to remain single. Despite the attention from several kind women at his new job at Empire, he couldn't bring himself to date. In his eyes, he was still a married man until the divorce was finalized. Only once the divorce papers were officially signed did he allow himself to move on. When the divorce was finally complete, Tim went out to celebrate with friends from work, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. A few months later, Tim received an unexpected call from Candy's mother, Bernice. "Tim, this is Bernice. Do you have a moment to talk?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Of course, Bernice," Tim replied, sensing something serious. "What's going on?" "It's about Candy," she said, her voice breaking. "She just received some devastating news." "Tim. She's HIV positive." Tim was quiet for a moment, digesting the information. "I'm sorry to hear that," he finally said. "But honestly, I'm not surprised. Our divorce is finalized, and I don't carry any responsibility for her anymore. She's not covered by my insurance, and I have no obligation to help her." "I understand that, Tim," Bernice said, her tone pleading. "I was just hoping you might be willing to talk to her. She's in a really bad place right now, and she could use some support, even if it's just a few words from you." Tim hesitated. He didn't want to get pulled back into Candy's life, not after everything she had done. But the sadness in Bernice's voice gave him pause. "All right," he said after a long silence. "I'll come by, but just for a few minutes." "Thank you, Tim," Bernice said, sounding relieved. "It means a lot." Later that day, Tim drove to Bernice and George's house, steeling himself for the encounter. When he arrived, he was shocked to see how thin and frail Candy looked. Her once vibrant appearance had faded, and she seemed to have aged years in a matter of months. She approached him slowly, but he waved her away, maintaining a distance. Candy's eyes were filled with sorrow as she invited him to sit on the sofa. "You look good, Tim," she said softly, attempting a smile. "Better than I remember. How's everything going for you?" Tim kept his response brief. "I'm doing fine, Candy. New job, new friends, a fresh start. How are you?" She sighed, looking down at her hands. "Not well. You know about my diagnosis." "Yeah," Tim said, his tone neutral. "Your mother told me. I'm sorry to hear it, but like I said, I'm not surprised." "Do you know when you got infected?" Candy nodded sadly. "I think it happened one of the times I was with Jake. That day I slept with several men at his house. We weren't exactly careful." "Does Jake know?" Tim asked. "No, not yet," she replied, her voice trembling. "I'm going to have to tell him soon. I doubt he'll take it well." Tim leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I wouldn't expect him to." Candy hesitated for a moment, then looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Tim. I wanted to apologize, one last time. I know I've said it before, but I realize now how much damage I caused. Not just to you, but to myself, my family. Everyone. I had the perfect husband, the best life, and I threw it all away for something so shallow. I know you probably hate me, and you have every right to, but I can't go to my grave without asking for your forgiveness." Tim sat there, considering her words. Tim sat in his chair, his mind racing as he grappled with the heavy weight of his emotions. It was the first time he could recall Candy truly taking responsibility for her actions, acknowledging the pain she had caused others. While he could have easily continued to harbor resentment towards her, he remembered the wisdom he had gained from his counseling sessions with Rose. Holding on to bitterness would only hinder his ability to move forward. "Okay, Candy," Tim said quietly, his voice steady but soft. "I forgive you." Candy burst into tears, sitting in a chair across from him. Tim considered reaching out to comfort her but stopped when she waved him off gently. "Thank you so much, Tim," she said through her tears. "This means more to me than you know. I want you to find someone who can love and trust you. Marry her, have children, and build a life together. I'm done. But you still have your whole future ahead of you, and you deserve happiness." Tim nodded, appreciating her words. "I'll do that," he promised. "And if you ever need to talk, just let me know." Candy wiped the tears from her eyes and nodded. "I will. Thank you for coming and talking to me. I've missed you so much these past few months. Tim replied calmly, I miss the woman I married too. By the way, how are things with Jake and Mike? Candy shook her head. It's not good. Jake has become very cruel since he lost in court. His business has suffered significantly. You probably know that. Tim nodded. I've noticed. Has he hurt you physically? Not yet, she said, but his behavior is harsh and intimidating. Do you want me to be there with you when you tell him about your diagnosis? Tim asked, his concern evident. No, but thank you for offering, Candy said. This is my responsibility, and I need to handle it myself. I keep thinking, she continued, that if I had just told him to leave that first day of camping, things might have been different. We might still be together. It's possible, Tim said thoughtfully. But I have a feeling that sooner or later, something like this would have happened. He's been after you for a long time. Candy agreed, her eyes tired. You're right. I'm really exhausted and need to rest before I come back. Thanks for coming. This means more to me than you know. You're welcome, Candy, Tim said. Remember, if you just want to talk, call me anytime. She gave a weak nod. I will. Goodbye, Tim. Think about me from time to time. Tim sensed a somber finality in her tone and worried that she might be contemplating something drastic. I'll do that, he said gently. Just don't do anything foolish, okay? Candy managed a small smile. I won't, she assured him. As he prepared to leave, Bernice approached him. Thank you, Tim, she said, embracing him tightly. It means more to her, and to me, than you can imagine. You're welcome, Bernice, Tim replied. Please keep an eye on her. I will, she promised. A couple of weeks later, Tim was on his couch, eating dinner and watching the evening news when a report caught his attention. The presenter announced, the bodies of a local businessman, his son, and a woman believed to be the businessman's mistress were found earlier today. Police are investigating what they suspect to be a double murder-suicide. Tim's heart sank as he listened. Jacob Hudson, president and founder of Hudson Consulting, along with his son and an unidentified woman, were found dead from gunshot wounds. Authorities are still investigating the incident and will release more details as they become available. In shock, Tim immediately called Bernice. When she answered, her voice was choked with tears. Bernice, what's going on? Tim asked urgently. We just got word that Candy is dead, Bernice sobbed. It looks like Jake shot her, then his own son, and finally himself. Oh my God, Tim said, his voice filled with sorrow. I saw the news report and hoped it wasn't her. I'm so sorry. It's her, Bernice confirmed. The police think she told Jake about her HIV, and he lost it. They're doing an autopsy now. I never wanted this to happen, Tim said, his voice heavy with regret. I hope you know that. I know, Tim, Bernice replied. Candy made her own choices and paid the price. It's still incredibly hard to lose your only child like this. I'm just grateful you were able to find some peace with her. If there's anything I can do, let me know, Tim offered. Thank you, Tim, Bernice said. Candy's memorial service was held a couple of weeks later. Tim took a day off work to support her parents. The autopsy results revealed that Jake, Mike, and Candy had all been HIV positive. The news was a somber reminder of the tangled web of decisions and consequences that had led to this tragic end. After learning about Candy's diagnosis, she confided in Jake that they should all get tested. When Jake and his son Mike discovered they, too, had tested positive for HIV, the news drove Jake into a state of desperation and despair. In a tragic culmination of his grief and anger, Jake fatally shot Candy before turning the gun on his son and finally, himself. Tim was left to process the shock and sorrow of these events. For several days, he immersed himself in mourning Candy's death, reflecting on the years they had spent together and the life they had shared. The memories were bittersweet, clouded by the profound sense of loss and betrayal. One day, as he was grappling with his grief, Tim received an unexpected visit from Cynthia Stone, a colleague and representative from his team. Cynthia greeted him with a warm smile. "Hey, cowboy," she said cheerfully. "You look like you could use some company. How about joining us for happy hour tonight?" Tim hesitated for a moment, contemplating her offer. He was tempted to decline, feeling that he might not be in the mood for socializing. However, the prospect of some distraction and the chance to be around others pulled him out of his inertia. "You know what?" he finally said, his voice softening. "I think I could use some good company right now. I'll join you." "Great," Cynthia said with a smile. "We're meeting at Hitchhikers after work. Hope to see you there." "I'll be there," Tim replied, his spirits lifting slightly at the thought of an evening out. As Cynthia left, Tim thought to himself, so the cycle of life continues. He appreciated the offer of companionship and the chance to step away from the heavy shadows of his recent past. And with that, he prepared to move forward, taking solace in the fact that life, despite its harsh twists and turns, still offered moments of connection and renewal. As he looked ahead, he reflected on the unpredictable nature of life and the hope that the future held brighter days.